there's a spark of divinity in every person on earth, and that we all have to recognize that as we respect the dignity and worth of every person.
Well, that's an amazing statement by Speaker Pelosi. She is asserting an amazing principle of law and of Western civilization, that human beings are unique, that they share a spark of the divine. There's something spiritual about being a human being, and that's been asserted throughout Western civilization. How nice of her to affirm that. We're going to talk about what it really means and its significance for us right now in this episode of Life Matters.
Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives, as California Commissioner on Aging, as Chairman of the California Pro-Life Council, on the board of the National Legal Center for the Medically Dependent and Disabled. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Well, welcome back to Life Matters. We're your program on the right to life, on the culture that has emanated from that singular foundation that there is a right to life given by a creator in which the government has a duty to protect. Our founders wrote that out quite clearly. And that it's a right that can't be taken from us. It's an inalienable right. That if the government tries to take that or refuses its duty to protect lives, that right is still there. It has simply been violated. That's an interesting concept. It means there's a higher law that's at stake. And that's what Mrs. Pelosi was referring to. But was she rightly referring to it? We'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about how common this is in our culture. People appealing to a higher authority, a higher law, a sense of justice, a sense of propriety that goes beyond our social norms. You see, a lot of our society is dysfunctional, and people know that intuitively. But the question is, what then is a just government? What is a right society? That's the issue we've got to examine, and that's our duty to examine. We do it here. When we talk about the right to life on this program, we're talking about a foundational premise that applies to all of us and to all societies. And where it's not being protected, that society is unjust. Many listeners to this program know that it's very clear that in China, that is an unjust society because human life is cheap in China. In fact, anyone who adopts a Marxist worldview, by definition, that view cheapens the intrinsic value and worth of human lives. Well, that's a serious issue. And we need to realize just how serious it is when it comes to laws and lawmaking. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about how Hollywood frequently invokes this sense of justice and injustice. But are they applying it properly? What does it mean that there's a higher law by which we will hold others accountable and by which we can hold whole societies accountable? What does that really mean? You know, we did do that at the end of World War II at the Nuremberg trials. In Germany, their defense was what they did was legal. They simply were following orders. But by killing their own innocent citizens, they were violating a higher law. This was a crime against humanity. And we're going to talk about why this has significance. Finally, we're going to talk about why voting. Yeah, we're bringing it back to voting, and it's an appropriate time to do so. Why voting is your best way to reflect the true higher law, the true laws of nature and of nature's God, that we've been given the gift to enforce and protect in our nation. We've been given the gift of Western civilization's values. Now, many people misunderstand that and twist the principles of Western civilization against itself. And it's sad. You see it every day. You see that in Nancy Pelosi. You're going to hear from Joaquin Phoenix in just a little bit. Joaquin Phoenix quite eloquently talks about his feelings regarding what he perceives to be injustice, but he also admits the subjectivity of his own feelings and his own inadequacies. And yet, when we appeal to higher law, to the laws of nature and of nature's God, we're appealing to a standard that is above our human day-to-day feelings. We're saying it's a higher principle that we must follow if we're going to have a just society. So we're going to explain where that comes from and how we've done this before as a nation. Did you know that that's exactly how we ended slavery? It was only because we are a Western civilized nation that we ended slavery. And yet many people today, they're taught this in school. Oh, well, Western civilization is evil. Look at white Americans are bigoted and we're slaveholders, and therefore Western civilization is bad. We need to throw everything out. But they're making that appeal based on the principles of Western civilization, on the principles that there is a higher law. You need to know this, and this was reported in February of 2020 in Reuters. Do you know that still today, half the nations of the world have no laws against slavery? I'll say that again. Half the nations of the world, even as we speak, have no laws against slavery. The only reason America could end slavery, and the British as well, they led the charge. The Brits were ahead of us in ending slavery, not only in their own country, but on the high seas and in Europe, because the British appealed to the laws of nature and of nature's God, that it was wrong to own another human being. That's a principle written in a higher law. It's not a sociological law. In fact, half of the nations of the world are still following the lower law, that if I can control you, if I have the power to control you, then I will. That's not a higher law. That's the law of the jungle. That's the law of the strong. Controlling the weak, that's what's unjust. So the fact is half of the world still has not ended slavery. It is only because we built our nation on the principle that there's a higher law, which we must follow if we are to embrace just laws. So as we talk about today's situation when it comes to the legalized act of human abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, regardless of any other condition, Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton have asserted that that human baby is owned, and you can dispose of a human being you own, which is the same issue as slavery, that you could own a human being and you can dispose of that human being at will. Well, that violates a higher law. And because we're a nation built on laws and principles and higher principles, we have the ability to address this. And so we must. Our advantage, though, is this. Intuitively, our society knows this. Mrs. Pelosi mentioned it, and we're going to hear in just a little bit from a rather powerful and emotional speech from Joaquin Phoenix as he explains his sense of justice and injustice and what needs to happen. We'll be right back.
Life Matters continues after this.
Well, hi. I just wanted to thank you for joining me. You know, I have good friends, children, young adults, and adults that have Down syndrome. And they are so loved. Their parents love them so much because they're the happiest people you'd ever want to know. I really love them. I'm going to tell you something, though, that's rather frightening. The government of France has now prohibited showing positive images of Down syndrome children and letting parents know how lovable they are. That's an actual law in France. Here in the U.S., 80-some-odd% of Down syndrome kids are killed by abortion before they're born. In France, it's 96%. So we're not a whole lot better. If you'd like to help out, you can go to the National Down Syndrome Society, ndss.org, to help out. That's ndss.org. We really are in a battle of ideas, and lives really are at stake.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Welcome back. We're going to pick up again with Nancy Pelosi. And remember what she said.
There's a spark of divinity in every person on earth, and that we all have to recognize that as we respect the dignity and worth of every person, and as we recognize our responsibilities with that spark of divinity within us. And so when the President of the United States says about undocumented immigrants, these aren't people, these are animals, you have to wonder, does he not believe in the spark of divinity, the dignity and worth of every person? These are not people, these are animals. the President of the United States. Every day that you think you've seen it all, along comes another manifestation of why their policies are so inhumane and why we have to continue the debate, striving for bipartisanship with openness about what is at stake and what the choices are, and to be unifying in every way possible. Calling people animals is not a good thing.
There's a spark of the divine in all of us. And she's making an appeal to what is actually stated by our founders, that we've been given certain inalienable rights by our Creator, that we have a Creator, and that right to be alive, that right to share certain spiritual qualities. And that is the premise of Western Civ, that human beings are more than merely mammals, that human beings have certain qualities that we can appeal to justice and to a higher law, and that we are able to perceive that there is a higher law. But the president was not referring to all illegal aliens. He was quite specific in speaking of MS-13, the most vicious and dangerous gang to ever exist in America. These individuals target only the vulnerable innocent. They stay away from policemen. It's not like the mafia who kills quickly. These people don't use stilettos that quickly kill people. This gang actually flails individuals alive, skins them alive. This gang actually uses machetes to not kill quickly, but to hack off limbs and watch their vulnerable innocent victims to create terror in the urban community. It's the most evil form of primitivism and the strong ruling over the weak. That's why this gang is acting like animals, and that's why the good laws must be used against them to restrain this great evil. Mrs. Pelosi is prohibiting them from being extradited precisely because they are here illegally. The president is right. This is about just laws, protecting the vulnerable innocent. If you've listened to this program before, I have some Christians who have told me they don't believe in natural law. And I'm stunned, but the problem is they confuse it with another phrase, and that is the law of natural selection. That is exactly the opposite. The law of natural selection is an assertion that the strong rule over the weak, and that's how it is in nature, where the strong can have their way. That's how animals live. That's why the lion is king of the jungle, lex talionis. Well, that is not what our founders were appealing to. The laws of nature and of nature's God refers to the fact that, again, I want to tell Christians, this is what the scripture says. So if you are a Christian, you should be the first to advocate for the laws of nature and nature's God. It says in the book of Romans that God has revealed his invisible nature through his visible creation so that they are without excuse. That is to say that God's principles have already been written in his creation. And it's not for the casual inquirer. It's for those who really want to know what is right. And if you look, you will see it, that there are principles, and that is that you not murder. And as many have said, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, is actually a reflection of the higher law, that taking that which is not yours, stealing. A lot of these principles are actually written in our hearts because of the fact that we're part of creation, and we can see deeper things. The reason we can see deeper things is, as Nancy Pelosi says, we have a spark of the divine. We can see deeper principles that animals can't see. An animal cannot appeal to justice. An animal can have emotions and feelings, but emotions and feelings are not the basis for justice, for a higher law. And that's an important distinction. And we need to recognize that if we only follow our feelings, we're not following the laws of nature and nature's God and higher law. We're following our feelings. And everybody wants to follow their feelings. That's understandable. And that is where we err, in mistaking our feelings for higher principles. And unless we as advocates for lives underscore that this isn't about our personal feelings or even our religious feelings, we have to underscore this is about a higher principle that transcends our feelings. If we fail to do that, then we will fail to reinforce why we need these just laws. We're going to listen now to Joaquin Phoenix, and here Joaquin is appealing on the basis that there is a higher law, on the idea of justice and injustice. But you're going to see that he quickly slides into issues then that are about feelings, about the diversity of feelings, and that there's many, many different feelings, but he is not appealing anymore to the principle that there is a higher law, that there is a right to life for human beings. And as even Nancy Pelosi says, that human beings are more than mere animals. No, unfortunately, Joaquin slips into disordered thinking, which is extremely common in our day.
But I think the greatest gift that it's given me, and many of us in this room, is the opportunity to use our voice for the voiceless.
Joaquin also points out that there's a commonality which all of us have, and he's right. Nancy Pelosi admitted it too. We have a higher understanding intuitively. We know there's a higher law and a sense of justice. But then Joaquin slips. He slips away from that overarching principle into subjective feelings. And he creates a litany of many, many issues that are no longer about a higher law.
I've been thinking a lot about some of the distressing issues that we are facing collectively. And I think at times we feel, or we're made to feel, that we champion different causes. But for me, I see commonality. I think whether we're talking about gender inequality or racism or queer rights or indigenous rights or animal rights, we're talking about the fight against injustice. We're talking about the fight against the belief that one nation, one people, one race, one gender, or one species has the right to dominate, control, and use and exploit another with impunity.
Now, I'm not knocking a particular religion, but I am pointing out that the basis for Joaquin Phoenix's statements and for many religions is, in fact, in feelings. I feel for animals. Animals have feelings too. It's important to recognize that. We have to have empathy. But human beings are not mere animals. And the taking of a cow's life is not the same thing as the taking of a human life. And when we equate these, we are failing to make distinctions. We are failing to understand the real nature of this higher law, the real nature of justice. When it has no specificity, when there is as much wrong with killing a cow as killing a baby, then it loses all significance. This might make a Hindu happy to hear this speech, but even a Hindu wouldn't have been happy, because what happens is when you follow feelings, they go all over the map, as Joaquin Phoenix has reflected. He is reflecting there's many, many different feelings of injustice, but they're feelings. He has moved away from the principle of a clarified higher law, and yet he is asserting there is one. He is asserting that we have this understanding. He actually asserts that
I think that we've become very disconnected from the natural world, and many of us, what we're guilty of is an egocentric worldview, the belief that we're the center of the universe. We go into the natural world and we plunder it for its resources. We feel entitled to artificially inseminate a cow, and when she gives birth, we steal her baby, even though her cries of anguish are unmistakable. And then we take her milk that's intended for a calf, and we put it in our coffee and our cereal. And I think we fear the idea of personal change because we think that we have to sacrifice something to give something up. But human beings at our best are so inventive and creative and ingenious. And I think that when we use love and compassion as our guiding principles, we can create, develop, and implement systems of change that are beneficial to all sentient beings and to the environment. Now, I've been a scoundrel in my life. I've been selfish. I've been cruel at times, hard to work with, and ungrateful. But so many of you in this room have given me a second chance. And I think that's when we're at our best, when we support each other, not when we cancel each other out for past mistakes, but when we help each other to grow, when we educate each other, when we guide each other towards redemption. That is the best of humanity.
Human beings are creative and redemptive, and they can bring answers, which is much more than animals can. So he's asserting this very principle, that human beings stand apart from the animal world and therefore bear some responsibility for their moral actions. This is a significant premise, but he's also departed from the premise. And that's the problem with our culture. And that's also a problem for us if we don't realize that when we're appealing to society to protect innocent babies, this isn't about my feelings about babies or my feelings about my theology or their theology. It isn't about theology. It's about an objective, demonstrable fact. Just as the founders asserted that this is an objective, self-evident truth. Just as Lincoln asserted that it is human lives that are being lost in slavery. Just as it still needs to be asserted. Again, Western civilization isn't done getting this message across. As you know, Western civilization is under attack from confused people like Nancy Pelosi, like Joaquin Phoenix. And here's, I know a lot of actors, by the way. And one thing actors do too is they really get in touch with feelings. And that can be impressive. You can tell stories very effectively if you're in touch with the human feelings that are impacted through those stories. So actors tend to have a lot of respect for feelings. But if those feelings become your guide and your moral compass, they'll lead you all over the map. And it will lead to confusion and what is called disordered thinking, that we have to be able to come to logical conclusions based on sound principles. And that's what our nation built itself upon. The idea that we're a nation not of strong versus weak. We're not a nation of men, but of laws and principles. And that's what's guaranteed our freedom. And really what's known as the greatness of America comes from that foundational premise. And most Americans intuitively know it. Where we go off base is where we indulge our feelings, and that creates confusion. When we come back, we're going to talk about why all of this does get down to elections and to laws. Sorry, I know it's hard to talk about political things, but unless these things are reflected in the law, unless the higher laws, which Joaquin and Nancy freely admit exist, unless our laws reflect these higher laws, there will be only injustice and unhappiness. And so ultimately, just as with slavery in our nation, and again, remember, there are many nations that have not ended slavery. Many nations, still half the nations of the world, according to Reuters, have not banned slavery. And that violates the higher law. So our work isn't done. And particularly when it comes to killing the vulnerable humans in our midst, innocent human beings. When we come back, we'll talk about what you can do and why the coming elections are really, really important.
Life Matters continues after this.
Life Film Fest is the creative outreach in Hollywood that's changing Hollywood and the culture. There's many films you've already seen that actually had their start at Life Fest in Hollywood, their premiere. But more than that, we work with people throughout the industry who want to creatively bring the message of life. Not just hit you over the head with it or preach to you about it, but creatively impact the culture so that hearts and minds of our fellow citizens understand the depth and the breadth and the warp and the woof of what the right to life really is. Be part of Life Fest Film Festival and make a difference.
Every life does matter. Every life is significant. Find out about the exciting cultural change impacting Hollywood. Go to lifefilmfest.com. And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Okay, we spent some time today with Nancy Pelosi and time with Joaquin Phoenix, and they made a great case that there's a higher law. They also pointed out that people are easily confused by their feelings of injustice, without quite understanding what justice is, and that justice is best reflected by adhering to the higher laws, that the innocent be protected. You know, the reason that in all societies we have policemen that are given authority, they're given badges and guns, it's to protect the innocent. That's a foundational premise for all just societies. And if the innocent are not protected, you do not live in a just society. That's a principle that transcends your feelings and mine. That's part of the laws of nature and of nature's God. We're living in a nation now that kills millions of children every year. These children are declared to be owned by the mother. And a physician, or even now in many cases a non-physician, can use medical tools to kill this child. And so this is violating even medical ethics, which we've had for thousands of years, that said medicine should never be used to harm, and it's being used to kill. The only way to change this, just as the only way to end slavery in the United States, was not by merely not liking slavery. There were many during the Civil War that said they didn't like slavery, but it was only those who worked to change the laws that ended slavery. And that was Lincoln's message. He had to make sure that the laws protected those who cannot protect themselves. This is essential to us being a just nation. So in this coming election, I'm going to urge that you find out where candidates stand. This is not merely one more of many, many social issues. As Joaquin pointed out, there's so many social issues out there that people have different opinions on. This is not one. This is actually an issue of higher law. Will the innocent human being be protected under the law? And unless you elect people who will stand for these principles, we're not going to change the laws. If you do elect such people, then they can work to enact just laws. They can work at every level of government. One day, Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton will be overturned. But then each state will be able to protect children. And right now, in your state like California, like in our state of California, we can stop funding abortion. We can stop giving our dollars to Planned Parenthood. We can stop opening our schools to Planned Parenthood counseling centers within the schools. You can do that if you elect people who understand the higher principles of why lives should be protected. So pay attention to this election cycle. Every vote counts. Just as in slavery, it was important to pass the 13th Amendment. There were a lot of other things going on, but it was the passage of the 13th Amendment, ultimately, that ended slavery. And the passage could only come about when pro-life, anti-slavery lawmakers were elected. Let's win in these elections. Let's make a difference for life. For your list of pro-life candidates, go to californiaprolife.org and click on Voter Information.
Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life.